Welcome to School and Around, a podcast hosted by Branching Minds, featuring prominent leaders, subject matter experts, and thought innovators with their perspectives on the current challenges facing K-12 education. I am your host, Larissa Napolitan, a former teacher, instructional coach, and a member of the Branching Minds team, here to lead conversations and to shine a light on phenomenal educators and those that are on a mission to transform our schools and the lives of students. Maybe you've been listening for a while, or this is your first episode. If you like what you hear, would you do us a favor by rating and reviewing us on iTunes? This is a fantastic way to tell us you enjoy what we are creating. Also, if you want more MTSS resources, sign up for our weekly newsletter using the link in our show notes, and check out our website for all the blogs and guides you would ever need about MTSS. Implementing and sustaining MTSS in secondary schools is no small feat. The diverse needs of high school students combined with the limited time that we have with them before graduation make this work both complex and urgent. Today, we are honored to welcome Farah Assiraj, the CEO and founder of Care Education Consulting, to the show. And Farah brings a wealth of expertise in professional learning, instructional materials, and MTSS, as well as years of impactful leadership. And so we're so excited. She's going to share a little bit more about herself, but we're so excited to have her join us to dive into a thought-provoking conversation around these challenges and opportunities of supporting secondary students through sustainable MTSS strategies. So welcome, Farah.
Thank you, Larissa. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Branching Minds, for this invitation.
You're welcome. I'm so excited to chat with you today. And I know you have just a wealth of expertise. And so I would love for you to just share with our audience a little bit of your background and why this work is a passion of yours, and maybe even what brought you into the MTSS work.
Oh, absolutely. I'd be happy to. I think originally, prior to MTSS, there was RTI. Those who have been in the field long enough know the response to intervention world. I started my career as an ELA and reading teacher, moved into a reading interventionist role. And then in that process, started leading our reading work and RTI in particular. And so I served a lot of students who were in the kindergarten to third grade, primarily kindergarten and first grade at the time, within reading intervention that was supporting mostly decoding and phonics skills. And I quickly saw that those students were on various trajectories dependent on their needs. Multilingual learners, for example, did really well with systematic decoding. Many of them had exited the intervention and met the benchmark with DIBELS. And so that also meant, there was an expectation that they were going to do really well when they entered third grade. What I later saw over the years was those students actually really struggled in terms of comprehension in meeting third grade standards and our state assessment in Massachusetts, the MCAS. So I learned from then and continued on as a teacher, leading student support and success teams, which are part of the MTSS model, when I was also a high school teacher. And so a lot of the work I did as a high school teacher and leading that work, I bring with me today, as well as a principal and implementing MTSS. And at the Boston Public Schools, I led the MTSS strategy and brought together over 25 offices and 50 district leaders to really work towards a systemic coherence with implementation of MTSS. And then lastly, my last role was with the Council of the Great City Schools as the Chief of Teaching and Learning. And in that role, I supported district leaders who are leading MTSS, as well as SEL, social emotional learning, or restorative justice, behavioral health, and so forth. And so a lot of this work sort of comes full circle for me in terms of how to best support districts, school settings, as well as classrooms and students, and integrating families and communities in that process.
Well, I got so excited when I had the opportunity to chat with you initially about this conversation. And so I'm so excited to dig into this topic around secondary MTSS, because I myself, as a former middle school teacher and instructional coach, am so passionate about the work that teachers do at the secondary level. And so I would love for you to just talk a little bit about your vision for that sustainable MTSS implementation in secondary schools, particularly as you worked in the Boston Public Schools, so particularly in urban settings. What do you see as that kind of like key components for long-term success?
That's a great question. I think it also, I'm going to peel back the layers because it starts really with implementation. And what I've learned is that you really have to have a sustainable model or working towards a sustainable model with a fidelity model for implementation. I think for large urban districts, many really struggle with the continuation and continuous improvement upon implementation. Some really are sort of stuck at that sort of stage and cycle where there might be some systemic challenges in terms of staffing and retention that might sort of impede the ongoing process for implementation at the district. Certainly, with implementation and sustainability, it's really important to identify based on your initial self assessment. As I highly recommend that districts conduct a self assessment to really identify what are some of the challenges, gaps, and also opportunities where they are strong. For example, if you have instructional leadership teams and other teaming practices, those are really fertile grounds for continuing the MTSS model and or amplifying that work at school sites. I think there are a lot of great indicators that ensure sustainability, but there has to be continuous improvement cycle and at least a way of sort of monitoring the process to ensure,
Mhm.
yes, this is moving and moving in the direction that we'd like to see. As well as ensuring that, if we're not making gains and or if we're seeing that there is, for example, more siloing across departments, or we're seeing that the disproportionality in special education or discipline is still at higher rates. Those are indicators that we're not doing as well if we're servicing all students and all learners. So there are many ways in which we can think through those indicators that can live in our system and at a school level. But I think making sure that the students and families are integrated in that is really part of the systemic approach of sustainability.
Yeah. And I think that was what I was really excited to chat about, is just at the secondary level how important it is for students to be involved in that process and their voice to be represented, because we know, especially I think in the high school level, as they're nearing graduation, so much of where they're at or their needs, their academic or whatever support needs that they have is so crucial to their future success or whatever their future choices are. And so I love that. Do you have any sort of particular strategies that you've seen be effective in fostering those student agency and preparing those students kind of beyond high school?
I think the reality is that very often what we hear is we value student voice and student agency, but really it has to be how are we observing that in practice and creating the systems and really the instructional models and design to ensure that young people who have tremendous talent and brilliance and ideas and interests are part of the learning process. I really believe that as adults, we should be learning from the young people. We should be asking those questions and really using an inquiry model in terms of what are you interested in learning? What do you sort of see yourself in terms of pathways and not just as in college, but also various careers and take into consideration the technological advances of where we are. I don't believe that we're meeting the needs of many of our students right now with our traditional schooling model. And we see that in terms of the high rates of chronic absenteeism in a lot of districts, as well as just real life economic and other challenges and barriers that students are facing. So, my go-to is really how to ensure that SST with Student Success Team and MTSS team, however you want to label, that team. But really, there has to be a mechanism and a wraparound service that supports all students. But moving away from this, approach that we're going to wait until the student has missed 20 school days, for example, to a preventative model and approach where we are engaging students. We have, created supports and systems in place, from relationship mapping to adults to peers to inverse mapping, right? So from the adult to student, and really identifying those assets again that students bring, to also have the conversations around what are their challenges, what are their needs, how do we as a school define the narratives of students if we don't talk to them and we don't seek, the information from them and their stories. And I think too, I've spoken to students who have said, my daughter included, who's now a freshman at college, who just said, I'm disengaged because I'm just bored. Like this isn't as interesting to me, and or the structure of the class. And so we all know that not every classroom structure is conducive to every learner. So part of that is really how are we engaging teachers to ensure they're teaching it, high expectations and maintaining a high
Hmm.
bar for student learning. That is really crucial. Even more now than ever, we need
Yeah.
criticality and knowledge building. We need our young people to be valued for what they think, what they bring. And so for me, that is all really part of that student voice. So, it's really about, again, matching those relationships and identifying from that strong tier one and engagement for students to really bring in other ways that they can demonstrate their learning through some real life experiences that they can, or at least real life practices that they can bring as an experience for their future growth. I think we have to really push our districts and states, and I know some states are obviously working towards this, but really rethinking the high school model for high school students in this current era that we're living in. So I think it's a both and. We know there are systems and structures that have been more adaptive to student learning
Yeah.
and project based, and really sort of moving towards that deeper learning with flexible options and choices for students. So that would be my vision and hope for our young people, is to really bring their voices in, and to really listen to them, and to take that constructive feedback, and make our education system, especially in high school and secondary, better.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, even for many years when I was an educator, we talked a lot about, preparing kids for the future, helping them be more self-directed, like trying to change the way we taught to help them as we saw the future unfolding, right? Like there's many things, and we often would say, like, there's going to be jobs that exist in the future when they're ready to graduate and be in the workforce that we couldn't even imagine now, which is, 15 years later, I'm thinking, yes, that was very true. you know, Influencer wasn't a word 10 years ago. So it's just so interesting to think about how, I mean, and I feel like sometimes that many leaders are unsure of how do we even shape this, because there's so many possibilities. How do we open up, a high school to be a different experience for students in what they might need in the future? But I think it comes back to sort of the willingness to say, let's adapt to what our students need. And that's so much of what MTSS is, right? Giving students what they need, when they need it, how they need it. And so I imagine, what does the MTSS framework in high school look like in the future? Like what, how does that shape the schedule? How, all those different things. Um, so how do you sort of envision MTSS addressing these kind of developmental and even transitional needs that students have in high school? How do you see that? How do you see that connection?
I mean, I think MTSS is a lever for many things, to be quite honest. I mean, I've been a champion for MTSS for a reason, and especially in high schools. When I taught at high school and led the SST and MTSS teams, I was also the ESL, the ELA, and intervention teacher for multilingual learners, and also students who were duly identified with a disability. I had many students who arrived at the age of 18 and 19 as newcomers. And so I think that we, often, this is where MTSS really comes into the fold, is that we often have perceptions in education about who makes up a student and what they need. And this goes back to the student voice. And so that reality of, I may already have a thought about my pathway, and or maybe I also may feel defeated if I've missed school because of health issues, or because I've had many students, for example, who were working. And so sometimes they would miss 2 days of my class, but they would be there for the other days. And so that sort of flexibility in terms of the transition to reality for some of them has already occurred, and is already in their life as a young adult with responsibilities. And so it's important to really think about what is the teaming aspect at the school site. We had an amazing social worker. We also had guidance counselors. They were all a part of the team in the fold when we talked or discussed students through the referral process, not for special education, but referral for MTSS intervention and support. That could be that they need additional language support, or that they need double dosing for math intervention and or small group intervention for reading, or more around sort of fluency and decoding. It really depended on the student. And so MTSS can also work to, have a life plan. So we, working through, again, through the teams, so we created student profiles and student plans to transition not just from the classroom and programs, but some also needed to transition who had disabilities at the age of 22 to specialized programs. So we wanted to make sure that, we always thought through what are the current needs, but also the long-term needs of students based on those conversations with them and their families, with the reality that that could change at any moment and any day. As even adults, right? We have a
Mhm.
right to change our opinion and view and what we want to do and how we want to seek it. But it's really important to be able to cultivate a path where students feel that they can be successful. And I think more importantly, the relationships matter in those
Mhm.
cases. And I think we did a really great job of creating foundational trust and building those relationships so that students could share the fears that I have, or the hopes, or the aspirations.
Yeah.
And I'll just add quickly that one of the tremendous benefits, at least from my community in Boston, I used to teach what I was referencing in the high school, it's Boston International Newcomers Academy, BINCA the acronym, is that we had a very strong support system internally as a school and as teams, with an amazing leader who, both the leaders that I'd worked under in my time there. But the other factor is really strong partnerships with community
Mhm.
members and partnerships with organizations, community-based organizations. So they poured a lot into those students, those internships. PIC was one that offered students internships and really kind of gave them a leg into like the working world. And so I think as much as possible, those opportunities, it's outside of just dual enrollment and college credit. It's the real life experience that some
Yeah.
students.
Yeah, I think that that's to me, we underestimate the importance of that kind of program. And I know there's many high schools, I've worked in districts that have had great partnerships with a technical college, or they've had partnerships, or they've built out, career and tech ed kind of programs, sort of to give students opportunities to get into the workforce or to get into programs that they are interested in. And I think it's so phenomenal and it's so empowering for those students. Because what I've seen is those students feel so empowered for what their future holds because they already have that tangible experience in the workforce. And every student is different in what they want in the future, but it's that piece of giving them a choice in that and giving them that opportunity, their own agency into deciding what they want. I think is really powerful to them see then their engagement in the other parts of their education can be more it can increase because they see because of those other opportunities. So I love that you had that kind of the partnership. And I think community partnerships are so key for the success of MTSS because there's so many needs that students have that without community partnerships, and I would go at every level of education, the community partnerships can be really essential to the work.
100%. I think when you have a really robust MTSS model, you're able to utilize the community schools model within that and really leverage the resources and assets of your community partners so that you know that if you have young teen moms, for example, that you may have a daycare supported, or funded, if you have high poverty and also, food, which we did, we had a lot of those supports, and that is a part of MTSS. And so I think I always encourage everyone when I speak of MTSS to sort of think outside of the umbrella. Like, what is the container that is holding, all of these pieces? And we cannot do this alone. Part of the revamping that I did in Boston Public Schools wasn't just to redefine MTSS. It was really to create this foundation around communities as healing, as schools as healing centered places as part of that community, and to ensure that when we speak of students, it's all in contact with families and communities that they belong to. So there's this thread. So it's not just the student. A student belongs to a family. That family belongs to a community.
Mhm.
And so we're all really interconnected in that way. And that's where MTSS can really be, again, if done well and with a robust implementation, can really be a huge lever to bring some of those systems together.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right in the fact that, so many schools, I know I worked in a school that really it was in a community. It wasn't a small town or suburb, but it was really a community built around a school. And so it was so interesting to see how tight knit that community could be, and how, and really the school was the center of that. And so, I think that it's important for educators to kind of consider of like, how is the community involved in the work that we do. So I love that. I do want to go back to something you talked about, part of MTSS is really about that preventative,
Mhm.
or the early identification for risk, and so we've talked on this podcast before about early warning systems and how that can really help identify those students. And I think especially at the secondary level, seeing that disengagement happen sooner rather than they're right about to drop out or they're, failing all their courses, like how essential that is. And so can you maybe talk a little bit about maybe strategies you've seen and that can be tailored to students that are at risk, for dropping out or just struggling with that disengagement?
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to be quite honest, this group really tugs at my heart. I was a student who was near dropout, and most people, don't assume that when they see me as my full-fledged adult self. But a lot of my work has been to really target these students particularly because very often it's a missed opportunity in our schools, in our classrooms, because the reality is an MTSS, again, if done really well, is a lever, and or another way to say it is a vehicle towards really ensuring that students are moving towards that thriving. So really want to flip the language from like students at risk or struggling and trying to survive to thriving, and shift it to really ask, what are the conditions for students to thrive? How do we actually create those conditions, make sure that they're fertile so that students are welcomed, that they want to come back, that they want to engage, that they want to learn? Because I think very often we sort of stifle the engagement in our classrooms, and then we say, well, they're disengaged, and there might be more. Again, that's why it's really critical to have those conversations with MTSS and to create a model where one of the things that I did with BPS is in the SST was that qualitative data was essential for teams. You had to have an interview with the student. It was a part of that intake process. So when you're, thinking of students who are at risk, what does that mean? What are the indicators? What is the data? What are the assessments? What's the history? And I think Branch and Mines has done a really great job with the student profiles. Instead of looking at the historical data, students don't just arrive at day one and all of a sudden are sort of falling off the charts unless we're not doing our part. And so part of that is, how are we monitoring the data, the assessments, and the reality is we make a lot of assumptions as humans. And so moving towards that, moving away at least from that ladder of inference and making assumptions to really, understanding what's the context. If a student is missing too much school, do I have a relationship enough to know that they might have a health condition? Asthma, for example, are there particular indicators in their profile that might be able to inform or that we can glean that there might be additional support? And the other is that as adults, and as practitioners, we have to be mindful of our role, right? And what I mean by that is that students are, their motivation, intrinsic, extrinsic, is also fueled by how we show up, how we teach, how we engage. And so as much as, we put an emphasis on student motivation, I think it's really important to sort of put that mirror back and reflect it on ourselves as the adults and practitioners. How are we modeling, the motivation that we have for learning? How are we engaging brilliant students who are coming here to like soak up the knowledge and learn from us, and to make sure that we're really continuing to sort of interrogate and self-assess in terms of how we're doing the work,
Mm.
so that students feel connected to the curriculum, that they are feeling that there is an engagement or tasks that are challenging them cognitively. Many students are not engaged because they're not challenged.
Yeah.
And or, right? And so I think, the task maybe isn't clear, or the scaffolds, if you're a multilingual learner and you have a different language, that's a beautiful asset. And so how do you draw, from the assets of languages and or disabilities, and think about, again, the assets of those students to connect that back to the learning.
Yeah.
And so I think there are multiple avenues, but I think ensuring that we foster those relationships, and I go back to relationships because they're so crucial. And I get it, right? I was a teacher at high school. When you have over 100 students, it can feel like you're
Yeah.
missing touch points with every student.
Well, and it can feel like sometimes when leaders say build relationships, it's like it almost it's like cliche, but it also just feels like, well, I'm already doing that, or I'm already working towards that. And they mean well, but it sometimes lands a little hard when you have that many students, and it's to engage, try to build relationships in that way. But that to me is where that team model is so important.
Absolutely. And I think SEL, I did a daily SEL check-in. When students came in, we did sort of just the circles. We held, we did, I mean, it was fun. It was engaging. I probably had the best time in my career being a teacher to high school students than any other time. But I think it's also attending to when a student is disengaged, checking in. It doesn't just have to be an SEL check-in, and making sure that, again, we're not making assumptions about what's happening, but that there's an opportunity to sort of tap into the student and their emotional well-being, and to make sure that we're talking with those teams about what wraparound services may be needed.
Yeah. Well, I think I had a conversation with someone recently, and talking about how the best way to combat that assumption or the bias that maybe that we bring into a meeting about students, right? Because we bring in our own experiences, our own perceptions about why a student might be missing classes, to really look at the data, right? And to go back to, they consistently miss class on these days, or or even just information that has been provided rather than just going off of assumptions. And that's where you build those relations with students, so then if they share information, you can have that recorded or whatever it is. And it's just important to make those decisions, and have those conversations around the data, and not so much around the assumptions or the biases that we may bring into the conversation.
And that's a really great point, right? When I say data, it's always qualitative and quantitative. And then also part of that qualitative is the student perspective and the family perspective in interview. And I think it's something as small as, when we think of chronic absenteeism, how is it that a student can be missing for 5 days and we've not made contact? So I think, like, we've got to, again, really do the interrogation around what are our processes, what's in place
Mm-hmm.
in order to have a preventative model, that is really looking at those at-risk indicators. You have to have processes in place, right?
Yeah.
And they have to really be at an early benchmark, not when students have missed 10 or more school days. And or so I think we have to do a better job of implementing those processes in place for everyone to have clarity around who does what. When I was a school principal, I was very clear. The teacher makes the first contact with students, miss 2 days, by the fifth day where I'm calling or the assistant principal is calling. It has to be really clear cut.
Mm-hmm.
And more importantly, there has to be a plan of re-engagement.
Yeah.
And the students have to feel valued, right? And so this idea of like how we, again, kind of present as adults is really important, because we do not want them to feel like they're not there to learn, or that they have missed too much. I mean, it is a re-engagement depending on how much school is missed, has been, lost in learning, can absolutely feel like there's a process of time and attention to that individual. But, thinking of the scheduling and intervention blocks and other methods to really get them sort of caught up. The most important thing is that we want them in school. We want them to know they're brilliant, and that one momentary, timeline isn't definitive, right?
Yeah.
It's a lapse in time that they should really be able to, continue to feel motivated, or at least encouraged by us to feel motivated, so they don't feel defeated. And I think that's, again, where we have some missed opportunities for re-engaging students.
I do think that you have a good point of like the longer that they are out, the more intimidating it is to try to come back and
100%.
re-engage. And so making that re-engagement path easier for students who are absent, and I think even too is just like students who, we would get this a lot in middle school, as they start failing and they're like, well, it's an F now. There's no way there's no way I'm going to get caught up. And so they're so drowning in that failure or that feeling of failure that it's hard for them to see how actually, if you just do this and this, what it takes. So often I would like go through my grade book and be like, okay, if you did this, if you got this score, this is where it'd be, to really help them understand that, right? Because I think when they're that age and middle school and high school, they really can't see, their life experience doesn't give them that perception of like, oh, it is possible to improve, to come get back to where I need to be.
No, you're 100% right, and which is why I also changed, grading to equitable grading policies, right? Because students, when they already are encountering so many barriers, it can be really overwhelming, especially at that age developmentally. And
Yeah.
so again, really thinking about those conditions and the fertile grounding of thriving. What would that look like? How do we create those conditions for them to feel
Yeah.
confident to re-engage?
Well, grading is a whole other conversation.
Of course.
So my last question really relates to leaders. Like, what could leaders do? What could they do tomorrow? And in thinking about this, if you're thinking about secondary leaders, what's one thing that they could do tomorrow to really, whether it consider student agency or improving just the perception of your educators in the room? What could something they could take away and start thinking about or implement tomorrow for secondary MTSS?
Yeah, I think honestly, it's probably as simple as two things to start with. There's, I'm sure, a lot more, but after you've done your self assessment, I think leaders have to really rethink scheduling at the high school level to include, I mean, there are so many different terms, right? Whether it's swim block, flex block, it doesn't really matter what you call it, right? A research block. Independent block. I think what's happened in some districts, and from what I've learned and seen, is that then it becomes like a free study block, right? So it has to still have adult intervention support and structure. And so moving from, a structured support, and really creating those opportunities for students to receive tier 2 and 3 supports if needed. Again, aligning back to tier 1. And so there has to be a mechanism for that. And your mechanism really is your teaming structure, and how to work through some of those processes as a team, how to really think about what your agendas are in your referral process, in your data monitoring. When do we go back into looking at the data? Is it 6 weeks? Is it 8 weeks? But how are we partnering with the family? When do we do the interview with the student? So all of that teaming processes is really crucial for a leader to support and to guide and to be a part of. I think um, we had a really strong leader that emphasized that those processes are up to us as a team, and we were trusted to sort of create those. So they might have looked different depending on the grade level, but you could absolutely start with a framing and a process that can, be across grade levels, and then sort of divert or make it applicable depending on your students and that classroom. So I would say those are two that really sort of stand out. I think obviously there's always more around the SEL and connection to academics, and sort of how do we really nurture young people
Mm-hmm.
to leverage their assets and to really see them as brilliant young people who can inform us as adults. That's one that I'm going to continue to push on as a leader. You really honestly should be having conversations with your students all the time about what's working, what's not working, what are you learning, what do you love about, that's part of the leadership role.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I loved about being a leader, stepping out of the classroom. I missed my students, but the best part was when I got to see my students, and it was, how was your day? Tell me something you learned. What can we do better? And young people love to give you feedback.
Oh
They
yeah,
love
they love to give
surveys.
you
They
feedback. They'll
love
tell you.
surveys.
It
Right?
will be unfiltered. That I think that's what I loved. I would always give survey. I gave lots of surveys to my
Yes.
students, but I wanted to know really what they think of, like, are you bored? Are you, what's your blocker for learning this material? And I mean, they would sometimes be so brutally honest. It would hurt my feelings a little bit, but I mean, I'm an adult. They're 13. It's fine. And so, but it was just really a good chance to get like really what they were thinking and how they were feeling about the experience in my classroom. And it really did impact how I utilized that feedback to shape my lessons and shape how I presented material. It was really informative of like, oh, they don't like when I just lecture, or like when we do a lot of group projects, they need a little more direct instruction. Those kind of things are so crucial. So that's like one way, even just to encourage like your educators to like utilize that student survey. And sometimes it's just a small, a short little survey or form
That's
that they
right.
can fill out. It's just easy to
Absolutely.
get that kind of feedback. So,
Yeah,
um,
and I know we're wrapping up, but I would just say that I really see our young people as our future investment. And we have to acknowledge that we're just not investing in them in the way that we need to, but they are the core of who we are in the future as well. And so I really see it as an opportunity for who we will be. So we invest now, and we really have to invest smart and long term, and that is going to be a return investment for us as older
mhm.
generations. And I'm hopeful. Young people bring me a lot of hope, which is
Yeah.
why I love working with them directly and mentoring them, because those are honestly the times and opportunities where I feel like the lightest, and I also feel the joy, and I feel encouraged by their heart and vision and what they bring. So that would just be my push, is rethinking how we do high school and supports, and MTSS is one of the greatest levers. It's not going to be a solution. There are multiple variables and reasons why. But I absolutely believe that we can invest in our future and invest in our babies towards it.
Oh, well, on that note, that's fantastic. Thank you. I appreciate you being here and just talking through this topic. It's a passion of mine, and I'm excited to share this with our listeners just to give them some food for thought. And so, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Larissa, and Branch Minds team.
Thanks for listening to Schoolin' Around, a podcast hosted by Branching Minds. Go ahead and subscribe to our feed wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget, if you are enjoying our content, would you do us a favor and rate and review our podcast on iTunes? This helps others find our podcast and lets us know how much you love what we're creating. Branching Minds is an educational technology company using learning sciences and technology to help districts effectively personalize learning through MTSS. To learn more about us, check out our website, branchingminds.com, or follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn at Branching Minds.